Apple Podcast episode title, The Ghost of Treblinka, Mistaken Identity, War Crimes, and the Search for Ivan the Terrible.
In this deep dive, we explore one of the most complex, dramatic, and haunting legal sagas in history. Who was Ivan the Terrible, the notoriously cruel guard at the Treblinka extermination camp? We examine the shocking courtroom trials of John Demjanjuk, a suburban Cleveland autoworker accused of unimaginable war crimes, and unpack the chaotic collision of eyewitness memory, unearthed Soviet archives, and international law. We'll also look at a controversial U.S. Justice Department cover-up that a federal judge compared to the Salem witch trials. Whether you are a history buff or fascinated by the intricate twists of the justice system, this deep dive offers a thorough, impartial look at the quest for truth amidst the darkest chapters of WWII.
Ivan the Terrible, Treblinka Guard, John Demjanjuk, Holocaust History, WWII War Crimes Trial, Office of Special Investigations, Nazi Concentration Camp, Mistaken Identity, Soviet Archives.
Welcome to the deep dive. I'm really glad you are joining us today, because the historical saga we have in front of us is, and I really do not use this word lightly, it's staggering.
Staggering is definitely the right word for this one.
Yeah. We are going to be unpacking this startling, just almost unbelievable premise. I want you to imagine a retired suburban auto worker living in Cleveland, Ohio.
Right.
Just a guy who worked on a Ford assembly line. He raised a family, went to church, and lived what appeared to be just a completely ordinary, quiet American life.
The American dream, basically.
Exactly. So how does a man like that end up sitting in a courtroom in Israel, facing the death penalty, and being accused of being one of the most sadistic, terrifying figures of the entire Holocaust?
It's a huge leap.
It is, and our mission today is to sift through the fog of war and really decades of tangled evidence to understand the identity, the crimes, and the sprawling legal battles surrounding a Treblinka guard known to history only as Ivan the Terrible.
Which is just a chilling moniker.
Very. We are going to look at the fragility of human memory, the unbelievable complexities of international law, and we're going to try to make sense of a historical mystery that literally spanned continents.
And you know, it is a profound historical mystery, but I think it is vital to establish right from the start that the events we are exploring today go far, far beyond the guilt or innocence of a single man.
Right, it's much bigger than that.
Exactly. This is really a story about how the justice system itself grapples with historical atrocities decades after the fact. I mean, when the crimes are this absolute and the scale of the horror is this incomprehensible, how does the machinery of modern law handle the decay of physical evidence?
Yeah.
How does it handle the shifting geopolitical borders of nations and maybe most importantly, the deeply human, deeply flawed nature of trauma and memory?
That's a huge part of this.
It is. Over the course of this deep dive, we're going to be exploring the very limits of the legal process and what happens when the righteous pursuit of justice collides with the messy, often contradictory realities of history.
Okay. Let's unpack this. Because to even begin to understand how an auto worker in Ohio gets dragged into an international war crimes tribunal, we really have to understand the place where the nightmare started.
We have to go back to the source.
We do. We need to go back in time and look at the dark architecture of Treblinka itself. Because looking through the historical encyclopedic accounts of the camp, what immediately struck me was the management hierarchy.
It's not what people expect.
Not at all. I think when you or I hear the phrase extermination camp, our minds naturally populate it with an army of guards.
Right.
You picture thousands of German soldiers blanketing the perimeter, running the operations, but the records upend that assumption entirely. Treblinka was managed by a shockingly small group of German SS overseers. We are talking about only 20 to 25 men in total.
That number always stops people in their tracks.
20 to 25 men.
Yeah. The sheer industrialized scale of the atrocity orchestrated by such a small nucleus of SS officers is always one of the most chilling, difficult aspects of Holocaust history to process.
How is it even physically possible?
Well, it wasn't. They absolutely could not run a facility of that size, a facility specifically designed for mechanized mass murder, with just 24 men. So, to make the camp function, the SS designed and relied upon a highly structured, deeply cynical hierarchy of coercion and collaboration.
They outsourced it.
Precisely. They effectively outsourced the daily hands-on brutality.
And the records map out exactly who they outsourced it to. Beneath those 25 SS officers was a larger force of about 80 to 120 what they called Huey guards.
HIWI Hillswillage.
Right. And these were men of various Soviet ethnicities, including Russian and Ukrainian Red Army prisoners of war.
Yes, captured soldiers.
And then beneath them, at the very bottom of this horrific hierarchy, there was a cadre of Jewish inmates known as kapos.
Prisoner functionaries.
Yeah, who were forced under threat of immediate death to assist in the camp's operations. But what really fascinated me in the research was the language dynamics among all these different groups. It sounds like Treblinka was operating in absolute linguistic chaos.
Linguistic chaos is the exact right way to describe the environment.
Yeah.
And it was a chaos that the SS intentionally managed and exploited.
How so?
Well, the vast majority of these Hiwi guards had been trained at a specific SS facility called the Treblinka concentration camp.
Okay.
Because these men came from all over the conquered Soviet territories, they faced severe language barriers. They couldn't understand the German SS.
Sure.
They often couldn't even understand each other, depending on their regional dialects. And they certainly could not understand the predominantly Polish and Yiddish-speaking Jewish inmates.
So nobody can talk to anybody.
Right. To bridge this gap, a specific demographic became incredibly valuable to the Nazi command structure, and those were the Volksdeutsch.
I've seen that term pop up a lot in World War II history. The ethnic Germans, right?
Precisely. The Volksdeutsche were ethnic Germans who had been living in Eastern Europe, sometimes for generations.
Okay.
They were highly valued in this horrific ecosystem because they were polyglots. They were the linguistic glue holding the camp's operations together.
Because they spoke German.
They spoke German, which allowed them to take orders directly from the SS officers. But they also spoke Ukrainian, Russian, and other Slavic languages.
Which let them command the Hiwi guards.
Exactly. And perhaps most terrifyingly, many of them could understand basic Yiddish or Polish.
Giving them a direct line to the inmates.
Yes, a direct line of communication and control over the Jewish inmates. Because of this ability to bridge the language divide, most of the squad commanders among the guards were pulled from the Volksdeutsch.
And here is where the seeds of our entire central mystery are planted. The historical accounts point out something so seemingly mundane, but so crucial to everything that unfolds decades later in the courtroom.
This terminology.
Yes, the German and Austrian SS command, the local Polish population outside the camp, and the Jewish inmates inside the camp, they all tended to refer to these Hiwi guards universally as Ukrainians.
Even though they weren't all from Ukraine.
Right. They didn't use that label necessarily because every single guard was actually from Ukraine, but because the guards often spoke Ukrainian amongst themselves as a common default language.
It became a catch-all term, a monolith.
Exactly. And within that massive monolithic group of guards labeled simply as Ukrainians, there were names being thrown around by the inmates. The name Ivan was incredibly common among Ukrainians, Russians, and Belarusians.
Very common.
In fact, I was reading the testimony of a Treblinka survivor named Chil Rashman, and he explicitly noted that he personally knew of 6 different men named Ivan working as guards at Treblinka at the exact same time.
6?
6 men, all named Ivan, all called Ukrainians.
If we pause and connect this to the bigger picture, we really need to consider what this environment meant for the victims and how it laid the groundwork for future legal complexities. The SS deliberately insulated themselves. By using Soviet POWs, men who had often faced a stark choice between starving to death in a frozen German POW camp or volunteering for the Treblinka training program, the SS forced the dirty, hands-on violence down the chain of command.
They kept their hands clean, relatively speaking.
Exactly. For the inmates experiencing this, it created a blur of trauma. I mean, imagine being surrounded by men in various mismatched uniforms, shouting in German, Ukrainian, Russian, and Yiddish.
It's overwhelming.
When trauma of this magnitude is inflicted day after day, the human brain simply struggles to encode every specific granular detail like a camera recording a video.
You just go into survival mode.
Yes. Instead, the inmates categorized their tormentors by the overarching labels they heard shouted across the yard. The Ukrainians. The Ivans.
You're trying to track where the danger is coming from?
The sheer commonality of the name Ivan, combined with this linguistic blurring, created an environment where distinguishing one guard from another 40 years later would become a profound forensic challenge.
But out of all those guards, out of the half-dozen men named Ivan, there was one who did not blur into the background.
No, he did not.
One who stood out so starkly that his name became synonymous with the camp itself. And that leads us perfectly into his specific profile.
We have to talk about him.
We have to talk about the man who actually earned the nickname Ivan the Terrible. The historical records detail this specific individual. He was born in 1911, and the nickname, of course, was an allusion to the infamous Russian Tsar Ivan IV.
Right.
But he wasn't given this name by the inmates just because he was generally cruel. It was because of his specific duties in the camp and the unimaginable, personalized way he carried them out.
His primary function at Treblinka was mechanical but devastating. He was tasked with operating the 2 tank engines that fed the gas chambers.
Just running the engines.
Running the engines. And I think it is important to highlight a detail from the records. Those specific motors had been installed and fine-tuned by an SS Scharführer named Erich Fuchs.
That detail really stopped me in my tracks when I read it. The idea of an engineer meticulously fine-tuning a tank engine, not to make a vehicle run smoother, but to maximize the deadly efficiency of carbon monoxide exhaust for mass murder.
It is the absolute zenith of the mechanized, industrialized death the Nazis perfected.
It's horrifying. But while Erich Fuchs was the mechanic who set it up, Ivan was the operator. He was the man physically running the engines, throwing the switches that pumped the exhaust gas into the packed chamber.
He was the executioner.
He was. Yet reading the survivor accounts, it wasn't just the mechanical killing that made him infamous. It was his intimate, personal cruelty outside the chambers.
What's fascinating here, and I use the word fascinating in the darkest, most clinical sense, is how human memory latches onto specific types of terror.
Yeah.
The gas chambers represented a massive systemic horror. It was an industrialized, almost faceless bureaucracy of genocide. But what Ivan the Terrible chose to do outside those chambers was intimate, sadistic, and deeply personal.
This is extra.
It was chaotic violence. And that is what seared his face and his name into the minds of the survivors.
The testimony of that survivor we mentioned earlier, Chill Rochman, goes into agonizing detail about this. He testified that Ivan was about 25 years old at the time he worked in the camp. And Rochman described a level of extreme specific cruelty that is genuinely hard to even process.
It really is.
He testified that Ivan used to stand by the pathways and slice off the ears of passing workers as they carried materials.
Just as they walked by.
Yes. He would force these people to continue working, carrying heavy loads as they bled profusely from the sides of their heads, and then shortly after, he would outright kill them.
Unbelievable.
Rochman also testified that Ivan actively tortured victims with pipes, a sword, and whips right before they were forced into the gas chambers.
It is absolute, unadulterated sadism. He wasn't just following orders to run an engine. He was actively reveling in the infliction of physical pain.
He brought a sword to an extermination camp.
He used a sword, he used whips, he used heavy iron pipes. This wasn't the distant, disconnected push of a button from a control room. This required physical exertion to destroy human beings before they were ultimately murdered.
It's so visceral.
And returning to the concept of memory encoding, this is exactly why Ivan the Terrible became legendary among these survivors. Amidst the mass trauma of Treblinka, where thousands of people were being systematically murdered daily in a highly organized routine, Ivan's personal, unpredictable violence stood out.
It broke the routine.
It was a localized, terrifying reign of terror within an already unimaginable hell.
And we know this reputation wasn't something constructed decades later during the trials. It was cemented very early in survivor literature. By 1944, a cruel guard named Ivan, who shared his violent duties with another guard named Nicholas, was already being written about.
It was immediate.
Specifically, he was prominently mentioned in a 1945 translated work by John Demjanjuk called A Year in Treblinka. So right after the war ends, the ghost of this man is already haunting the surviving Jewish community.
His crimes are documented in the very first drafts of Holocaust history.
Exactly. But the records are very clear on one frustrating point. Ivan disappeared in 1945, and his fate was entirely unknown.
He simply vanished into the ether. Like so many perpetrators in the chaotic, completely destabilized aftermath of the war, he slipped away.
The Allies are advancing, the camps are falling.
The camps were either liberated or dismantled by the retreating Nazis to hide the evidence. He left behind no forwarding address, no clear paper trail, nothing but the profoundly traumatized memories of the few who survived him.
So I want you listening to imagine carrying that weight. Imagine holding on to those traumatic memories for decades. Imagine having the image of a man with a sword, a man who sliced off ears, burned into your subconscious.
You'd never forget it.
You build a new life, maybe you move to a new country, you try to move on, But you are always waiting for justice. You are waiting for the authorities to find the monster, which leads us to the explosive, headline-grabbing trials of the 1970s and 80s, and to the accusation that rocked the world.
The breakthrough.
Because suddenly the justice system announced they had finally found him. And he wasn't hiding out in a fortified bunker in South America or living under an alias in a remote village. He was living in suburban Cleveland.
The shift from the absolute horror of the Treblinka death camp to the quiet, manicured suburbs of Ohio is incredibly jarring, and it introduces us to the central figure of the legal saga, John Demjanjuk.
Right. John Demjanjuk was a retired auto worker of Ukrainian descent. He had emigrated to the United States after the war, settled in Cleveland, got a job working for Ford Motor Company.
Raised a family,
went to his local church. By all outward appearances, an entirely normal, unremarkable pursuit of the American dream. But throughout the 1970s and 80s, an investigation by the U.S. government gains momentum, and John Demjanjuk is formally accused of being Ivan the Terrible.
It made international news instantly.
The U.S. strips him of his citizenship, and he is extradited to Israel. In 1988, he is put on trial in Jerusalem for crimes against humanity.
We need to understand the gravity of that 1988 trial in Israel. It was a monumental, historic event.
Everyone was watching.
It was broadcast publicly, it was highly publicized across the globe, and it carried the immense, crushing emotional weight of the Holocaust survivors seeking justice in the Jewish state.
It wasn't just a trial of one auto worker from Ohio.
No, it was a societal attempt to put the Holocaust itself on the stand again, very much echoing the famous Adolf Eichmann trial in Jerusalem decades earlier. For Israel, this was about historical reckoning.
And the centerpiece of this trial, the moment that the historical transcripts detail with incredible cinematic precision, was the dramatic courtroom confrontation with the prosecution's star witness.
This is the turning point.
This was a Treblinka survivor named Eliyahu Rosenberg. I want to paint the picture of this courtroom scene because the tension is palpable even just reading about it.
You can feel it through the pages.
Rosenberg is on the witness stand. The prosecution asks him if he recognizes the man sitting at the defense table. Rosenberg looks over and asks Demjanjuk to remove his glasses. He says to the judge, quote, "So I can see his eyes."
It is a request deeply rooted in primal human instinct. We inherently believe the eyes hold the immutable truth of a person's identity, the core of who they are.
The window to the soul.
Exactly. For a survivor trying to bridge a gap of over 40 years, trying to pierce through the aging process of a man sitting in a suit, the eyes are the ultimate identifier.
So Demjanjuk obliges. He takes off his glasses. Rosenberg physically approaches him. He walks right up to the defense table and peers closely into Demjanjuk's face. And according to the transcripts, Demjanjuk smiles at him and offers his hand for a handshake.
Think about the psychological dissonance in that single second. The accused monster, a man on trial for his life, smiling and offering a polite handshake to his alleged victim in front of the entire world.
It's bizarre. Rosenberg recoils immediately. He shouts, "Grozny," which is Russian for terrible.
Ivan the Terrible.
Right. And then Rosenberg turns and states to the court, and I am quoting his testimony exactly here. "Ivan, I say it unhesitatingly without the slightest shadow of a doubt. It is Ivan from Treblinka, from the gas chambers, the man I am looking at now."
Without a shadow of a doubt.
He glares at Demjanjuk and tells the court, "I saw his eyes. I saw those murderous eyes." And then he turns directly back to Demjanjuk and exclaims, "How dare you put out your hand, murderer that you are."
It is impossible not to feel the absolute devastating power of that moment.
It gives you chills.
For Eliyahu Rosenberg, this was entirely real. The trauma, the pain, the absolute certainty he felt in his heart in that courtroom was a direct manifestation of the hell he survived.
You can't fake that emotion.
You can't. When a victim points a finger with that level of moral conviction, with that raw, unfiltered emotion pouring out of them, it is incredibly compelling to a judge and a jury. It is exactly the kind of testimony that secures convictions.
And in this case, it did. Based heavily on these emotional eyewitness identifications, Demjanjuk was convicted and sentenced to death by hanging?
He was put on death row.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because I struggle to understand how the court justified what came next. The defense uncovered a massive, glaring complication regarding that exact testimony.
The deposition.
Yes. The historical records reveal that this star witness, Eliyahu Rosenberg, the man who just confidently looked into Demjanjuk's eyes and identified him as Ivan without a shadow of a doubt, had given a sworn deposition decades earlier.
Long before Demjanjuk was ever in the picture.
Back in 1947, Rosenberg had formally testified to investigators that Ivan the Terrible had been killed during a prisoner uprising at Treblinka.
And right there is the massive fault line in the entire prosecution's case.
How does that even work?
This is where the legal system has to balance deep, profound empathy for Rosenberg's unimaginable trauma with the strict, unyielding requirements of the legal burden of proof.
But wait, how do we reconcile that? If you were tortured by someone, wouldn't you know if they were dead? How does a court just dismiss a 1947 statement that the man was killed and accept a 1988 identification that the man is sitting right there in the room?
It's a fair question.
Is it possible Rosenberg heard a rumor in 1947 that Ivan was killed during the chaos of the uprising and just believed it, but then decades later, when confronted with a face, his memory overrode that old rumor?
It is entirely possible, and it speaks to the well-documented unreliability of eyewitness testimony decades after an event. The human mind is not a tape recorder.
It doesn't just play back.
No, memories degrade over time. They are influenced by suggestion, by seeing photographs in the news, and by the intense subconscious desire for closure.
Right, because he wants them to have caught the guy.
Of course he does. When Rosenberg was shown photos of Demjanjuk by investigators prior to the trial, and when he was placed in the highly charged, deeply emotional atmosphere of an Israeli courtroom, his brain may have genuinely convinced him that this was the man.
Trauma is powerful.
Trauma has a terrifying way of fusing the past and the present. It is crucial to understand that Rosenberg wasn't necessarily lying on the stand. He may have been experiencing a deeply felt psychological truth. He believed what he was saying.
But believing it doesn't make it legally viable.
Exactly. The justice system demands a different standard. Legal truth demands empirical evidence beyond a reasonable doubt.
And as powerful as Rosenberg's testimony was, that 1947 deposition was just the first crack in the foundation of the case against John Demjanjuk. Because while this emotional trial was playing out in Israel in the late 1980s, the geopolitical landscape of the entire world was shifting in a way no one could have predicted.
The timing was incredible.
It was about to cause an absolute archival earthquake. The Soviet Union was collapsing. The Iron Curtain was falling.
The Cold War was ending.
And vast, previously impenetrable repositories of secret KGB and Soviet archives were suddenly being opened up to Western researchers and legal teams. And what was sitting inside those dusty archives changed everything about this case.
If we connect this archival earthquake to the bigger picture, the fall of the Soviet Union radically altered Holocaust investigations globally.
Because they had a monopoly on the Eastern Front data.
Yes. For decades, Western investigators and prosecutors had to rely almost entirely on Western documents and survivor testimonies like Rosenberg's. They simply did not have access to the meticulous, often brutal, and highly detailed records kept by the Soviet authorities.
Who were doing their own investigations.
Right. The Soviets had captured and interrogated hundreds of Nazi collaborators and guards after the war. When those vaults in Moscow and Kyiv finally opened, a tidal wave of new, contradictory documentary evidence flooded the international legal system.
And that tidal wave hit the Demjanjuk case directly. On July 29, 1993, the Israeli Supreme Court did something monumental.
They reversed it.
They overturned John Demjanjuk's guilty verdict, and they threw out his death sentence. They ruled that, based on the new evidence, there was reasonable doubt that he was Ivan the Terrible.
And we should talk about what that evidence was.
The archives detailed exactly what this new evidence was. Investigators found the written, sworn statements of 37 former guards from Treblinka.
37?
37 men who had actually been there, who had worked in the camp alongside the monster. And these statements identified Ivan the Terrible not as John Demjanjuk, but as a completely different man named Ivan Marchenko.
37 separate statements. The sheer weight of that archival discovery is staggering. And we have to consider the nature of these statements to understand why the Israeli Supreme Court acted.
Right, because why couldn't they just put these 37 guys on the stand?
Well, the records point out that many of these 37 former guards had either been executed by the Soviet Union shortly after giving these testimonies in the 1940s and 50s, or they had naturally died of old age by the time the 1990s rolled around.
So they're gone.
Yes. This meant they couldn't be brought into an Israeli courtroom, put on the stand, and cross-examined by the prosecution.
But the paper remains.
But in a legal sense, the volume and the consistency of their statements, taken decades before Demjanjuk was ever a suspect, created an insurmountable wall of reasonable doubt.
And it wasn't just that they named a guy called Marchenko. The physical descriptions in these Soviet documents were drastically different from John Demjanjuk. I was looking at the translated physical
They
profiles.
don't match up.
Not at all. One Soviet document described Ivan the Terrible, Ivan Marchenko, as having brown hair, hazel eyes, a square face, and a large prominent scar running down his neck.
A mixed skull.
A prominent one. Now, let's look at the physical reality of John Demjanjuk. The records state he was dark blonde, he had gray eyes, a round face, and crucially, he lacked that prominent defining scar on his neck. They were physically completely different men.
That physical discrepancy, especially a defining permanent feature like a large neck scar, is exactly the kind of hard documentary evidence that shatters an eyewitness identification made 40 years after the fact.
You can't argue with a missing scar.
The guards who gave those statements to the Soviet interrogators in the 1940s had absolutely no reason to invent a random scar or lie about his eye color. They were simply describing the man they worked with every day.
They were just stating facts to save their own skin.
Precisely. When the Israeli Supreme Court justices looked at this, they recognized the tragedy of the situation. They had the survivors' raw, emotional certainty on one side of the scale and the cold, unyielding archival reality of 37 separate confessions describing a physiologically different man on the other.
And the law is clear.
In a court of law, the archival evidence must introduce reasonable doubt.
So this incredibly intense trial, the emotional climax of a survivor confronting the supposed monster, the death sentence, it was all a devastating case of mistaken identity.
A complete misfire.
John Demjanjuk, the auto worker from Cleveland, was not Ivan the Terrible of Treblinka. But that realization immediately raises a massive question for you listening. If Demjanjuk wasn't Ivan, what actually happened to the real Ivan?
Where does Marchenko go?
Right. What happened to Ivan Marchenko, the man who sliced off ears, the man who ran the gas chamber engines? While an innocent man, at least innocent of this specific crime, was sitting in a cell on death row in Israel, the real monster had an entirely different story.
And the historical archives actually trace the trail of Ivan Marchenko.
They do. And tracing that trail relies heavily on the testimony of another guard found in those newly opened Soviet archives, a man named Nikolai Yegorovich Shelev.
Chile is a crucial figure here.
Yes, Shaleyev was a Russian who actually worked directly alongside Marchenko. He was also a gas chamber operator at Treblinka. And Shalayev's testimony maps out Marchenko's movements as the Nazi Empire began to collapse in on itself.
As the tide turned.
According to Shalayev, in July 1943, he and Marchenko, along with 2 Germans and 2 Jewish inmates, were transferred away from Treblinka and sent to Trieste, Italy.
Moving them away from the front lines.
In Trieste, Marchenko's duties shifted. The extermination camp was behind him, and he was now tasked with guarding German warehouses and a local prison. But then, in 1944, as the Allied forces were approaching Italy and the writing was clearly on the wall for the Nazis, Marchenko makes his move.
And this is where the historical narrative takes a cinematic, almost surreal turn.
It's like a movie.
The documents state that in 1944, Marchenko and a driver named Gregory, quote, fled in an armored car to the partisans in Yugoslavia.
It is genuinely mind-blowing. Think about the trajectory of this man's life.
It's a series of violent reinventions.
He goes from being a Soviet prisoner of war to operating gas chambers at an extermination camp for the SS, to guarding warehouses in Italy, to suddenly stealing an armored car and fleeing to join the anti-fascist Yugoslav partisans.
Talk about switching sides to survive.
That's not even the end of it. The final confirmed sighting of the real Ivan the Terrible, according to Shalayev's testimony, happened in the spring of 1945 in a city called Fiume.
And what was he doing?
Shalayev says he ran into Marchenko, who was coming out of a brothel. Marchenko told him right then and there that he had officially joined the Yugoslav partisans.
Just a casual conversation on the street.
After that moment, outside the brothel in 1945, Ivan Marchenko vanishes completely into history. The records do note that Soviet authorities were actively hunting for him until at least 1962, but they never caught him.
It highlights the deeply frustrating, messy reality of history, and particularly the history of post-war Europe.
It's just not neat.
Not at all. As a society, we want a neat narrative where evil is unequivocally punished and the bad guy is caught. But the truth is, Europe in 1945 was a chaotic, fractured, apocalyptic landscape.
It was totally destroyed.
It was filled with millions of displaced persons, shifting borders, and desperate people constantly reinventing themselves to survive. Sometimes the absolute worst villains simply slipped through the cracks.
They just melted into the crowd.
They used the chaos of the post-war displacement as a shield, blending into partisan groups or refugee populations to completely erase their pasts. Marchenko leveraged the fog of war to disappear, leaving nothing but a ghost behind.
A ghost that eventually haunted John Demjanjuk all the way to death row. But as we pivot back to Demjanjuk's story, there is a deeply disturbing element to this mistaken identity that we have to address.
The cover-up.
Yes, because you might be thinking to yourself, well, the Soviet archives were closed. The U.S. and Israel simply didn't know about Ivan Marchenko until the 1990s when the wall fell. It was an honest mistake.
I would hope it was an honest mistake.
But the historical investigations reveal a scandalous, dark twist. Some of that exculpatory evidence, the evidence clearing Demjanjuk and pointing to Marchenko, had actually been known years earlier.
Before the trial.
And it was deliberately withheld from the Israelis by the United States government, specifically by the Department of Justice's Office of Special Investigations, or the OSI, which was the very office that had urged Israel to charge him with being Ivan the Terrible in the first place.
This is where the legal missteps evolve into something much darker and more systemic. The OSI was established with a noble mandate to hunt down Nazi war criminals who were hiding in the United States.
A completely justified mission.
Absolutely. But in the Demjanjuk case, the zeal to secure a high-profile conviction superseded the fundamental tenets of justice. Withholding exculpatory evidence, which is evidence that points to a defendant's innocence, is one of the most severe ethical breaches a prosecutor can commit.
It's rigging the game.
It is.
The condemnation of the OSI's actions wasn't just a quiet, behind-closed-doors reprimand either. The records provide direct, scorching quotes from Judge Gilbert S. Merritt, Jr., who was a judge on the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit.
And judges do not speak lightly about other branches of the justice system.
No, they don't. I want to read his exact language because it is incredibly strong for a federal judge. Judge Merritt said of the OSI's handling of the case, "Today we know that they, the OSI, the prosecution in the case, and the State Department lied through their teeth."
Lied through their teeth.
He went on. Even then they knew without a doubt that Demjanjuk was not Ivan the Terrible, but they hid the information from us. He went on to say that if he had known the truth, the court never would have ruled in favor of his extradition to Israel in the first place.
So a whole trial shouldn't have happened.
But the judge didn't stop there. He compared the trial to a witch hunt. He explicitly said, "In retrospect, it reminds me of the witch trials in Salem, Massachusetts 300 years ago. The prosecution, counseled by the OSI, presented documents and witnesses whose testimony was based on emotions and hysteria, but not hard evidence."
That's a massive indictment of the process.
He finished by saying, "This instance is a prime example of how justice can be distorted."
That is an astonishing, unprecedented rebuke from a federal appellate judge. And I think it is crucial to analyze the specific words he uses. Emotions and hysteria. Witch hunt. He is pointing directly to the phenomenon we discussed earlier regarding the trial in Israel.
The reliance on the survivor's pain.
The OSI allowed the profound, justifiable emotional pain of the survivors. The tears, the anger, the visceral trauma broadcast from the courtroom to act as a substitute for hard, objective forensic evidence.
They let the emotion drive the car.
They knew the paper trail pointed to a man with a giant neck scar, but they leaned into the emotional narrative because it was powerful, it resonated with the public, and it secured a win.
So what does this all mean for us listening today? I want to be very clear with our audience. We are not taking a political stance here on the U.S. Justice Department.
No, we are looking at the historical legal record.
We are strictly reporting the federal judge's scathing assessment of the government's handling of the evidence as detailed in the historical record. We aren't endorsing a viewpoint, just conveying the facts of the ruling. But the implications of a federal judge saying the Justice Department lied through their teeth in a death penalty case are absolutely massive.
This raises an important question, an incredibly difficult philosophical and legal question about the danger of righteous crusades.
It's a slippery slope.
The Holocaust is universally understood as the ultimate historical evil. The desire to track down and punish those responsible is morally necessary. However, when the desire to punish historical evil overrides the strict adherence to legal truth, when prosecutors decide internally that getting a bad guy is more important than ensuring they have the right guy, the justice system itself becomes corrupted.
It undermines the whole point of a trial.
Judge Merritt is warning us that even in the pursuit of the most righteous cause imaginable, abandoning due process turns a trial into a Salem witch hunt. The integrity of the law has to remain absolute, regardless of how heinous the accused crimes are, or else the system fails everyone.
It's a sobering thought. The system broke down because it wanted justice so badly it was willing to manufacture it by omitting the truth.
And that almost cost a man his life.
But for John Demjanjuk, surviving the hangman's noose in Israel, returning to the U.S., and exposing this government cover-up wasn't the end of his legal saga.
Not even close.
Not by long shot. Because his story has a final chapter that is just as legally complex and cyclical as the rest of it. He gets his U.S. citizenship back for a time, but the investigations into his past do not stop.
They keep digging.
Because while the newly opened archives proved he wasn't Ivan the Terrible at Treblinka, investigators started looking closely at the documents to figure out where he actually was during the war.
And this leads to his subsequent final extradition, this time to Germany. The focus of the investigation shifts entirely away from Treblinka and moves to a completely different extermination camp, Sobibor.
Right. The new charge brought by German prosecutors isn't that he was the sadistic Ivan the Terrible who cut off ears.
No, the scale of the accusation changes.
The new charge is that he served as a low-level guard named Ivan Demjanjuk at the Sobibor extermination camp. And the key piece of evidence this time was a single document. An identification card.
The Tronicki?
Specifically, a Tronicki identification card that was, somewhat ironically given the previous history, supplied by the OSI to the German prosecutors.
I think we need to break down what this card actually is, because the entire German trial hinged on it.
A Tronicki card was essentially a personnel ID issued by the SS to the auxiliary guards trained at the Tronicki facility we mentioned earlier.
Like a military ID badge.
Very similar. It typically included a photograph of the guard, their name, their service number, and various stamps detailing their deployments. In this case, the card allegedly placed John Demjanjuk at Sobibor. It was the absolute documentary anchor for the German prosecution's case.
So without this card, they have nothing.
Without it, they had no physical evidence tying him to the camp.
But Demjanjuk's defense was consistent, and they fought this card fiercely. He claimed he was not the Ivan Demjanjuk who was a guard at Sobibor. He argued that the Tronicki ID card was a highly sophisticated forgery created by the Soviet KGB.
Which sounds like a wild conspiracy theory at first glance.
It does sound like a movie plot. But to understand why that was a plausible defense, you have to look at the history of the KGB.
During the Cold War.
Yes. The Soviet intelligence services had a known, documented program of forging World War II documents specifically to frame and discredit anti-communist émigrés living in the West.
It was a standard tactic to disrupt expatriate communities.
Since Demjanjuk was a Ukrainian émigré living in America, his defense argued he was a target of this KGB forgery program. The prosecution, of course, brought in forensic experts to test the ink, the paper, and the stamps, arguing it was entirely authentic.
It became a battle of forensic document analysis. Once again, it comes down to identity, faded documents, and the labyrinth of Soviet and KGB archives.
And he fought this in the German courts for years. But ultimately, the legal outcome arrived. On May 12, 2011, a German criminal court convicted him of being an accessory to the murder of over 28,000 Jews based on his service as a guard at Sobibor.
He was convicted.
He was convicted, but it was pending appeal.
And the appeal process in the German legal system has a very specific, strict procedural rule regarding the presumption of innocence.
And this is where the story gets its final, bizarre twist. John Demjanjuk was in his 90s by this point. His health was failing rapidly. He was living in a nursing home in Germany while his lawyers were diligently working on the appeal of this Sobibor conviction.
He's running out of time.
And in March 2012, at the age of 91, before the German appellate court could ever hear his case, John Demjanjuk died.
And because of that quirk of German law you alluded to, the historical record is explicitly clear on what happened next.
It erases it.
Because he died before the appeal was fully heard and exhausted, his conviction never entered into force. Under German law, the Munich District Court legally invalidated the interim conviction. They cleared his criminal record completely.
Wow.
And they legally declared him presumed innocent.
It is the ultimate display of the cyclical, almost absurd nature of this entire decades-long saga. It begins with an absolute lack of due process in the chaotic, murderous environment of a war zone.
Then it moves through the profound emotional turbulence of a mistaken identity trial in Israel.
It exposes deep, systemic corruption within the U.S. investigative process regarding withheld evidence.
And finally, it ends in Germany, the very nation that orchestrated the Holocaust. where a strict, unbending adherence to modern legal procedure forces history to leave John Demjanjuk in a perpetual state of legal ambiguity.
The law, by its own rigid rules, erases the conviction.
Exactly.
It is just mind-blowing when you zoom out and look at the whole timeline, from the agonizing, bloody reality of Treblinka's gas chamber engines to an incredibly emotional, tear-filled courtroom in Jerusalem, then to the shock of opening cold Soviet archives, to a federal judge's blistering anger over a cover-up, all the way to a quiet German nursing home where a 91-year-old man passes away, wiping the legal slate completely clean.
It spans the entire spectrum of human failure and legal process.
It really does. So I have to ask you, the listener, as we wrap up this deep dive, how does this story change your understanding of how we write history and how we administer justice? When we are hunting monsters from our darkest past, does finding a culprit matter more than finding the right culprit? We've seen exactly what happens when the system tries to cut corners to satisfy an overwhelming emotional need for closure.
And I want to leave you with one final lingering thought that sits at the very heart of everything we've discussed today.
Go ahead.
If John Demjanjuk died legally presumed innocent due to a technicality of German law, and if the real Ivan the Terrible, Ivan Marchenko, vanished out of a brothel and into the Yugoslavian partisans in 1945, never to be seen again, it means that Ivan the Terrible, one of the most documented, recognized, and feared monsters of the entire Holocaust, ultimately escaped the justice of the courts entirely.
Neither man was punished for it.
Neither man was definitively punished by the legal system for the crimes of Ivan the Terrible. What does it say about human history that our deepest, most profound desire for absolute justice is so often thwarted by the messy, chaotic reality of time, the fragility of memory, and the simple loss of missing paperwork? We desperately want the scales to balance, but history often refuses to cooperate.
That is a deeply haunting thought to leave on. The ghost of Treblinka remains a ghost. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly complex, heavy, deep dive today. Keep questioning the historical narrative you encounter, keep looking for the truth behind the archives, and we'll see you next time.